The Darling Songbirds, written by Rachael Herron, narrated by Exie Sands. Chapter 1. The saloon had always looked old-fashioned, but now it resembled a set in a ghost town. The boards creaked under Adele Darling's feet as if they hadn't been stepped on since women wore hoop skirts. Cobwebs on the porch slung themselves from top beams to bottom ones, and an old wagon wheel leaned against a hitching post in front. It was as if the sidewalk had been poured right around the post, and her Toyota hybrid looked completely wrong parked next to it. It should have been a horse. The problem was that Adele wasn't in an old western or a ghost town. Darling Bay was the sleepy gold rush town her great-grandfather had given his name to. The town she'd left for good a long time ago. There was a hand-drawn sign that said hours, 11 a.m. to 2 a.m. She glanced at her cell phone. Almost noon, and the doors were locked. Awesome. She knocked on the wood next to the iron screen door. "That won't do you no good." Adele spun. "Sorry?" The exceedingly short woman standing on the step below her wore a long, oversized blue dress that hung on her like a sack. Somewhere in her mid-60s, she had a well-creased face, like a crumpled envelope. A dozen or more necklaces dangled around her neck, crystals and quartz, and what looked like actual feathers on tarnished silver chains. Her short gray hair stuck up in spikes as if she'd just run her hands over it roughly, but her smile was wide. "He ain't here yet." Adele wasn't sure who he was. "Okay, but if you reach up above the door," the woman pointed. "Yeah, right there. You're a tall one, ain't you? Grab that key for us, will you?" It wasn't that Adele was tall at 5'5". It was more like the woman was eye level to her elbow. "Got it." Now that the key was in her hand, Adele had no idea what to do with it. It wasn't like she would just unlock the bar's front door, would she? She didn't have to make the decision. In a move so quick it surprised her, the woman snatched the key from her palm and unlocked the iron security door, swinging it wide open and barreling through the wooden half door as if she owned the place, which Adele knew for a fact she didn't. "Sometimes I've got to open up for him, you know." The woman moved to the right and snapped on 2 light switches and then headed for the bar. She was a low, fast-moving bowling ball in blue. "It's usually harder 'cause it's tough for me to reach that key. It's not like I mess with the till or nothing. I just help him out where I can." Adele trailed behind the woman. This wasn't the situation she had imagined herself in when she'd awoken this morning. All she'd known 4 hours ago in her San Francisco hotel was that she had a long drive up the coast. When she got to Darling Bay, she figured she would plan her next move. So she'd gotten in her rental car and headed north. Highway 1 wound through the redwoods, darting out to the rocky coast and back inland again. She'd stopped once to stretch her legs and had stood cliffside, watching elephant seals slap themselves up and down the coarse sand. It took a bit more than 3 hours to get to Darling Bay, a long enough drive to make her feel as far from Nashville as she'd ever felt. She used to be used to this feeling. This used to be home. And now she had exactly no idea what that meant. "You want a drink, dearie?" Adele blinked. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Well, I suppose I could ask you the same thing." That was fair. "I'm Adele Darling." "Oh, my God, you are." Crap. Adele should have just said her first name. What was she thinking? Nowhere else would her last name have raised more than a vaguely puzzled eyebrow. Sounds familiar, can't place it. But not here. The woman clutched at her pile of necklaces. "They didn't tell me that." "Who?" Adele was feeling more confused by the second. "I don't think anyone knew I was coming." But they usually tell me everything." She held up a chain that held a pink piece of stone at the end and peered at it closely. "Your necklaces tell you these things?" Adele kept her voice soft. Maybe it was better not to startle her. The woman stared at Adele as if she were crazy. "Not my necklaces, my dreams." "Ah, of course, it's not like they're always right. Sometimes they tell me a storm is coming when all that's gonna happen is I forget to take the kettle off the stove. Same thing." She waved her arms above her head. "Clouds of steam, just in my kitchen, you see." Adele nodded carefully. "Where are the other two?" The woman peered behind Adele as if she were somehow hiding her sisters. Not with me. Nothing could be truer. I didn't get your name. Adele held out her hand. The woman's shake was firm. Norma. And you're the bartender? Norma laughed heartily, but she spread her palms on top of the bar as if to negate her next statement. Oh, no, not me. You're a funny one. I'm just a drinker, from a long line of the same. Speaking of which, what can I make you? Not the bartender then, but not the bartender. How about a Coke? With rum? And can I read your tarot cards? Norma asked hopefully. I'm good on both, thanks. It was a bit early to start pounding liquor. So, if you're not the bartender and the saloon was supposed to open at 11, oh, he'll be here. Who will? This was beginning to feel like a game of who's on first. Nate. Nate? You don't know him? I haven't been here in a while, Adele said. If a while meant 11 years. She'd been far away from Darling Bay, sometimes as far as a person could get. When do you think he'll be here? Norma frowned and held one of her necklaces, looking upward as if the answer hung in the cobwebbed rafters. Soon. Then she filled a glass with Coke and slid it towards Adele. Here you go. Now, tell me everything. How are your sisters? You know, my dad, may he rest in peace, died before y'all got famous, but I always think he would have loved you. When your dad died, I asked my dad to bring him into heaven with a big old hug. Felt so bad for you young gals. Are you getting the band back together? You know, we talk about you all the time, and those magazines, they stopped printing those stories about y'all, and that's a good thing, but we never believed a word they said anyway. How's the little one, Lana? The back of Adele's throat itched. Fine. She had no idea how Lana was, and she never answered Adele's phone calls. The ache of it was dull and familiar. Do you mind if I have a look around while I wait for Nate? Sure. Norma bobbed up and down behind the bar, spinning into action. Tomato juice, sliced celery, vodka. A Bloody Mary doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Gotta work at it. She frowned and looked upward again. Unless you stare into a mirror, you know, and say those words. I'm not gonna do that. Okay. There. She added a dash of Tabasco. Mine isn't as good as Nate's, but I'm getting there. Just gotta keep working on it. Adele wandered towards the rear of the saloon. It was just as she remembered it. Dark and dusty, smelling of splintered wood and spilled beer. The old jukebox glowed neon blue and green in the far right corner. Next to it was a skinny ATM that had been added since she was last here. To the left of that ran the long bar all the way to the back wall. How many buckets of ice had Adele hauled out of the old storeroom? The girls had loved being there in the saloon, still underage, helping Uncle Hugh with stocking and refilling in the afternoons. They'd begged to be allowed to stay as late as they could, listening to the music, not listening until Sheriff Tate came in after a shift and raised his eyebrows at the little girls doing their homework in the far left corner on the big, scarred wooden table. The table was still there. Adele touched the top of it, feeling the ridges with her fingertips. People still carved their initials into it, using penknives and ballpoint pens. They didn't cut deeply, out of respect, perhaps. Surely they would have dug more deeply into a tree. And the well-worn initials looped over each other, years and years of couples who had loved and lost and loved again. When Adele and her sisters had done their math homework here, they'd had to make sure their notepads were under their papers or their pencils would stab through into the table scars. Somewhere on the table were their initials, too. All three of them. AD plus MD plus LD. Adele and Molly and Lana. Hidden now somewhere, buried by the map of other letters. Adele realized she was humming and closed her throat. She heard the refrain of "You'll never leave" in her mind. Then she wandered back towards the front door. And to the right was the stage, just a couple of feet higher than the floor. It was made of the same old wood, and if she remembered right, just as rickety. Impulsively, she jumped up onto it, stretching her arms wide. A light snapped on above her head, and she grinned in delight. Even when they were kids, Uncle Hugh had kept that motion-activated light there, and they'd loved the way it had shone down on them like a spotlight. "Sing us a song," called Norma from the other side of the saloon. Oh, hell no. Adele swallowed her grin and raised a hand. Maybe later. Or maybe never. The old pool table still stood in the same spot it always had. Adele could imagine a tsunami sweeping in and taking out the Golden Spike, carrying away the saloon and the cafe and the old hotel, the whole town of Darling Bay itself. But that pool table, as heavy as sin and older than Eve's apple, would stay right there, right where it had always been meant to sit. At some point over the years, the felt playing top had been repaired. Chalks, the old square kind, were lined up on the rail, and a half-dozen cue sticks leaned drunkenly against the short inner wall. Adele could almost hear the crack of the balls. Molly had been their ringer, always willing to bat her eyes innocently at whatever guy thought it would be fun to show off his pool prowess to teenage girls. Molly would run the table, stick the guy's money in her pocket, and then ask Uncle Hugh for a round of root beer floats for her and her sisters. Molly. She wanted Molly here. She pulled out her cell phone. Remember the root beer floats? Holding her phone in her hand in case the text actually managed to soar out to the cruise ship somewhere on the ocean, Adele used her other hand to lift up the bench seat in the front window alcove. There they were, all the board games they'd spent so much time with. She'd be willing to bet that the Monopoly set was still missing all the get-out-of-jail-free cards. Sheriff Tate had gotten his feelings hurt one night when he'd been on a particularly expensive Monopoly losing streak. And the sorry game. She pulled it out and lifted the lid. Yep, there they were. Each piece had little teeth marks at the top, marching all the way around. The blue piece was missing the round knobby top altogether. While Adele raced around the board, passing her sisters with a cheery sorry, Lana would get so mad she'd chew the pieces, leaving tooth marks behind, or, in the case of the blue one, biting the top right off. Adele glanced left. Norma was looking into her Bloody Mary as if it were telling a fortune, so Adele quietly slipped the headless blue piece into her jeans pocket. From the layers of dust inside the bench seat, no one would miss the piece anytime soon. She looked out the side alcove window. Across the middle parking lot stood the old cafe. Funny, she'd assumed it would still be open, that Hugh's employees would still be running it. But it was shuttered and dark, an unbearable sense of loneliness coming from the ripped awning. The old caboose that had been a coffee stand rusted in front near the sidewalk. She looked right up to the slight rise behind the saloon and cafe. That was the hotel, the third old building that she'd called home every summer of her youth. It was where she would sleep tonight. She yearned for that, for this already long day to speed up until she could just lie down, close her eyes, and breathe in the ocean-scented air. The phone, the real one that hung on the bar's back wall, jangled. Adele jumped. Norma grabbed it without hesitation. "Golden Spike, this is Norma." There was a pause. "Yeah?" She grinned. "Right again. You bet. I'll keep her running, boss. Yeah, okay. And, hey, I forgot to tell you I need a raise." She slammed the phone down with a hoot of laughter. That was him. She looked at Adele as if suddenly surprised to see her. "Oh, I should have told him you were here." "No, that's okay. I'll see him when he gets here." "So I guess you're the boss around here now." Norma was obviously startled by the thought, her gray eyebrows shooting higher. "Of course you are. Oh." Her drink wrapped tightly in her hand, she leaned forward from her bar stool. "You should tell him to hire me. I wouldn't drink all the booze. I swear I wouldn't." But there was a twinkle behind her expression that said the opposite was true, and that they both knew it. Chapter 2. Nate shouldn't have answered his cell phone that morning, but he was a sucker for a blonde, especially if the blonde happened to be 91 and living on the boat he'd sold her 5 months earlier. Ruth Ann Southers had asked, "Does it matter, dear, if my extension cord in the kitchen smokes a little?" Nate thought of the electrical fire at the hotel and told her to call 911. She said, "I already did. They said it was okay, but they shut off my power." Nate had sighed and spent the next 2 hours crawling around the baseboards in the boat's mess. He'd installed 3 new surge protectors, and he'd tested each outlet. By the time he'd finished, he'd bruised a knuckle and ripped his favorite Merle Haggard t-shirt. And he was late. At least Norma had been at the bar to open up. Unless a wandering tourist or two showed up, she'd probably be the only customer until 3 anyway. He parked his truck in front of the post office. Getting out, he pulled his Charlie's feed and seed ball cap on backward. What he really needed was another shower. Maybe he could bribe Norma with a couple more drinks off her tab to stay a little longer while he cleaned up. He took the 2 shallow steps off street level with one long jump. Inside the saloon, it was dim compared to the bright morning sunlight. Norma grinned at him from her regular bar stool. "Boss, you keeping out the riffraff?" Too late, he noticed that someone else was in the saloon, way over by the bench full of board games. Whoops. Not even a tourist, a pretty tourist at that, wanted to be called riffraff. "Nah, they're getting in. And hey, guess who it is?" He looked again. The woman was standing straighter now, pretending not to hear them. She kept her eyes out the side alcove window as if there was something more than just the old, closed Golden Spike Cafe across the parking lot to look at. And she wasn't just pretty. From this angle, she was a sight closer to beautiful. God, who did she remind him of? She must have driven up from the city or something. Some model waiting for her photographer to shoot her on the beach. He'd seen it plenty of times before. Pretty girls thinking it would be good to get shots of themselves in the water or leaning against the high cliffs down at Fenton's Cove, not realizing that the fog bank usually made it not only a shoot in bad light, but also a shoot where they'd freeze their dang nipples off. If they stayed till October, maybe. That's when the sun came out around here, after the summer tourists had given up all hope and left. But this woman, with her honeyed hair and that perfect long nose, those lips that were quirking into something that looked like it was close to a smile, she'd be shivering in her two-piece soon enough. "Howdy," he said politely. If his ball cap had been forward-facing, he would have touched the brim, but as it was, he left his arms at his sides. She turned to face him, and in that motion his heart dropped to the old floorboards and went right through, straight down to the dust and packed earth below, not stopping until it hit the world's molten core. Adele, darling, out of freaking nowhere. Chapter 3. Adele had never seen anyone go from exhausted to ready to fight so fast. She may have seen it on the television, watching boxing shows with old boyfriends, but not in real life. The man, Nate, obviously, was wearing a baseball cap backward, and it didn't look like he'd shaved in at least a day or two. His eyes were stone-colored, a weathered gray blue, and his skin was tan as if he spent time outside pounding things furiously with hammers, or maybe just those bare fists of his that were clenched at his side. He wore a ragged black t-shirt with what was probably once a picture of Merle Haggard. She couldn't fault his taste, but was now almost unrecognizable under a layer of dirt. His jeans, wide at the thighs and ripped at the left knee, were streaked with what looked like oil. And he seemed pissed as hell. "Howdy," she said back. As she did, she realized her mouth hadn't shaped that word since she and her sisters had quit singing. It used to be their thing, their brand. Up on stage, a round of happy howdies from all 3 girls, leaving the stage later with "Thanks, y'all." Sure, all the country singers had done it, but they'd meant it. They'd been raised on the music they sang, and a heartfelt howdy was no small thing. But now she wished she could take it back, along with her hand, which she'd already impulsively stuck out towards the man. She didn't, though. And eventually, he took it. His hand was dry and wide. At least it seemed he'd washed that part of himself. "I'm Adele, darling," she said. "I know." She took a quick breath. That's not the reaction I usually get. Really? He sounded like he didn't believe her. It was true, though. Before Norma had sort of recognized her, it had been months. Maybe, now that she thought about it, even a year or more. "What's your name?" She shouldn't have had to ask, and it was funny how it made her feel to do so, like she was standing on the wrong foot, about to topple over. "Nate Houston." What a country name. If she'd met a fellow songwriter with that handle, she would have known he'd made it up. Most songwriters' real names were Mark and Steve and Joe, but when they'd crossed into Nashville's city limits, they changed themselves into Rascals and Coles. Nate Houston, with its Texas town last name, was a home run of a songwriter name. Not that he would know that or care. "You're the bartender." He dropped her hand like she'd burned him. "Yep." He was a sight better looking than the last bartender, Adele remembered. Donna had been an institution at the Golden Spike with her flaming red hair that came from a bottle and an attitude that came from the same place, a different shelf. She was legendary for not only being able to drink all the customers under the table, but for storing her upper teeth in highball glasses and then forgetting where they were. More than once, she'd poured a gin fizz with a side of denture. Adele smiled in a way she hoped was unthreatening. Tell me more? He shrugged like he was trying to shake himself into a more casual appearance. Just that. Bartender, handyman, your general gopher. I helped your uncle out with near about everything around here. Sorry, by the way, about your loss. The words sounded forced, as if he wasn't that sorry at all. How long have you been working here? Adele tried to stay in one place, keeping her feet still. What she wanted to do was shuffle sideways, maybe get out of his solid granite stare, but she wouldn't give this alarming person the satisfaction. She needed his help, needed him to be on her side. It wouldn't do to lose the one guy who knew how this place worked. Long time. Oh, yeah? Why had her uncle hired this guy? Had they been close? At the mention of Uncle Hugh, she didn't even see the man twitch. Maybe there hadn't been much love lost for his employer? Although she had no idea who wouldn't love Uncle Hugh. He had been such a big personality, trumpeting and blustering and always, always loving. Adele looked at Nate closer. He didn't look familiar. She would have recognized him if he'd been around when they had lived in town, right? There was no way she could forget a guy with shoulders like that, even if he had a face and maybe the personality of a chisel. I left 11 years ago. Yeah. Ah, she wobbled. When did you come to town? 10.5. He shifted his weight. Years. The man made taciturn look chatty. Adele glanced toward Norma, but apart from watching them with big, interested eyes, she just stirred her celery stick in her now very low drink. Seems like we missed each other. We sure did. And he sounded so pleased about that. Look, Adele said, I'm glad you're here. I just need the lay of the land. So you can sell. Well, of course, it wasn't like she was going to stay and run this place, and her sisters were in the wind. Molly could barely find her phone often enough to text back, and Lana didn't answer her phone. Ever. For some reason, though, Adele was suddenly loath to admit this to the man. Of course, but I need more info on the property. You understand? Oh, I understand. His eyes said something else, and it wasn't a very polite word. Why did he seem so angry with her? Like this was some kind of power struggle. Well, two could play this game, whatever it was. Hadn't she been the champion at every board game ever made? Sure, Molly had run the pool table, probably still could, but Lana hadn't bitten the top off the sorry piece because she'd been furious about winning. No, Adele always won the board games. She touched the broken piece in her pocket again, reassuringly sharp. So, it looks like the place could use a little cleanup. Satisfyingly, she could almost hear his teeth clenching. A muscle jumped in his jaw. You're probably right. Maybe I could help? You had a look out the back yet? No. She hadn't even gotten as far as the storeroom yet, let alone the outside patio that led up to the old hotel. Maybe you can show me? This at least seemed to please the man. He dipped his head. I would love to show you around. Chapter 4. Hot damn, would he ever show her around? A lot could happen in 11 years. A lot could go wrong. Let's get started. Great. Her voice was cheerful, light. Let's see how long that would last. Watch your step here, he said, slamming open the door to the storeroom. That second step broke a while ago, but we found that the brick works just fine for balance, if you're careful. And if you didn't step on the left side of it, which would pitch you right off. He didn't need to mention that. It would be a simple fix, one that would take less than an hour. The step just needed a couple of new boards. That's why Hugh had put it off, and why Nate had too. There were always more pressing things needing to be done when the saloon wasn't open, and there weren't enough hours in the day to fix the old place up. Gotcha. He waved his arm down the row of boxes. Mostly drinks and mixers, some paper products. The only light was a bare bulb hanging directly overhead, low enough that he'd learned to duck when he moved through the room quickly. Oh, yeah. Her voice was soft, and she was looking at the ice machine with what could only be called reverence, as if it were something beautiful, instead of a dented piece of steel machinery that worked most days, except the hottest ones. Ice machine. Only sometimes it just turns into an ice bucket. Not ideal. Her face didn't change. Her smile actually pitched upward, and she ran her hand along the side of it. Wow. She was easily impressed. Adele laughed. This was our job when we were just kids. We got the ice for Uncle Hugh. She pressed her fingers to her cheeks. Silly, huh? We loved it. It made us feel so important. Somehow we thought that without us, he wouldn't have made it. That was closer to the truth than she knew, Nate would bet, and anger slid up his spine like a hot blade again. Yeah, anyway, he led them through the storeroom side door into the courtyard. Oh, my. Her voice was just a breath behind him. Nate crossed his arms and tried to see the space as if he hadn't seen it in years. He squinted. Yeah, that was all right. 5 years ago, he'd talked Hugh into letting him build an arbor over the small yard. He'd trained jasmine and a couple of grapevines over it, and now it was shaded most of the year. In the spring, it was a sweet-smelling heaven. And in the summer, tourists loved grabbing at the grapes that grew green and slightly sour overhead. 6 picnic tables sat lined up, 3 by 2, and some afternoons the whole patio would fill up with tourists and locals alike drinking beer and shooting the breeze. It was fall now, September. Early enough that the fog still hung on most of the day, and late enough that the tourists had packed up their tents and RVs and had trucked on home to wherever they came from so Kitty Jr. could go back to school. It was Friday, so it would be busy later, but aside from Norma and maybe Parrot Freddy, another of his favorite customers, a man who went nowhere without at least one of his 2 parrots on his shoulders, it would be quiet until early evening. And now that was proving to be a good thing. He was glad the courtyard was deserted, and he was glad it was still light. Even he could admit that when the twinkle lights came on, it looked magical out here. She didn't need to see that. I love all that ivy along the fence. It's wonderful, like a secret garden. I don't remember it being here. Yeah, I gotta rip that out. Wharf rats love it. Of course. Adele blinked. The grapes! She grabbed at one and popped it in her mouth. Her gasp and instant frown told Nate that the grapes were still sour. He gave her props for continuing to chew. Lots of people just spat them out onto the ground. And up we go. Nate took the back path at a quick clip, throwing open the low gate with a snap. You haven't been here since the fire, right? He heard her heels skid in the gravel as she put her brakes on. The fire? He knew Hugh hadn't told the girls about it. The old man had always wanted his nieces to think nothing had changed, that the Golden Spike Trio, its saloon and cafe, with the hotel on the rise behind it, was still running the way it had back in the day, years ago, before everything started to crumble. Yeah, I thought you might not know. He curled his fingers behind him, still not turning. Let's get this over with. The path wound through head-high greenery, up a steep slope to the rooms and back. Watch your step, he said again, even though he probably didn't have to. The girls would have run up and down this path probably hundreds of times, maybe thousands. The path was the same, but everything else had changed. Forming an upside-down U-shape, there were 4 rooms to the left, 4 straight ahead, and 4 on the right. Long porches ran the length of the building in front of each door. There used to be porch swings, too, one between each room, but only 2 were safe enough to sit in anymore. At least the garden still looked pretty, overgrown, but full of roses. What happened? What hadn't? Nate took the quick right that led up to the porch for rooms 9 through 12. It's not as bad as it sounds. A bald-faced lie. It was bad. He needed her to see that for herself. He felt her behind him, so close that if she'd reached forward, she could have grabbed his shirt. Lord, he hoped she didn't do that. Up the steps, then on to the long porch. Go ahead, Nate said. He pointed at the door to room 10. It's not locked? City girl now, huh? No, there's no reason for it to be locked. She pushed open the door. Oh. She pushed it a little farther. Oh, no. The room was bathed in cerulean light, the blue of the tarps that flapped in the wind overhead. This room had been the nicest one, a huge antique sleigh bed in pride of place with a matching dresser and long table. There had been a red velvet couch, and two comfy old armchairs had sat in front of the fireplace. The wallpaper had been deep green, and the pictures on the walls had been of the rocks and the ocean, hung in gilt-edged frames. Now there was nothing but the stained green carpet, the smell of the sea, and the constant flap, flap, flap of the tarps above. We moved the furniture to a storage place on Route 119. All of it is pretty heavily smoke damaged, but there's a company who said they could give most of it out if we were willing to pay them all the money in Hugh's bank account. Which wasn't much. He hoped like hell she knew it wasn't much. Adele stepped farther inside. She spread her arms, palms out, and looked up. Her face was light blue under the tarp's glow, and she looked like a frozen angel for a minute. Was she listening? Praying? She turned, drawing her hands in front of her stomach. Tell me what happened. The fire department said it was electrical. We knew we had upgrades to do, but Hugh kept putting it off, and I didn't think it was as bad as it was. Guilt twisted in his gut again for the 1,000th time. He'd checked the wiring twice. He'd climbed up in the attic, and he'd drilled a couple of holes. The wires had looked okay. Old, yeah, but okay. He hadn't seen any fraying, and when he tested them with the voltmeter, everything had seemed all right. It started in a wall in room 9, and went right up into the roof. Lost most of that. He craned his neck. As you can see. When? He thought. It was summer. God, a year ago now. Maybe 14 months? 14 months? Nate shrugged. Well, yeah, time flies. He'd been working on getting reclaimed lumber to start the beam work, but time kept slipping away on more urgent projects. It's not so bad, I guess. Wouldn't take much to fix it, right? Was she high? Yeah, they could have fixed it if Hugh had had any money at all, which he hadn't by the end. If Hugh had just sold to Nate, Nate would have been able to get a loan to cover at least some of the repairs, but as it was, he had to leave his money in the bank in the hopes Hugh would someday sell to him, instead of investing it in the property like he wanted to. It would take a lot, believe me. She looked up again. What about when it rains? What did she think the tarps were for? This is California. El Nino aside, it doesn't rain. What about the insurance? He rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, about that. Couldn't they get into this later, like over whiskey? Nate, who hardly ever drank, who had a very good reason not to drink, suddenly wanted a Jameson. Neat. Maybe a double. Adele's eyes blazed a light blue heat that had nothing to do with the tarps over her head. He was either insured or not, and since he was running a business, and I'm sure that there are municipal codes about these kinds of things, even in Darling Bay, he must have been insured. You'd think that, right? Oh, God. Let it lapse. After Gus Street's bus ran into the corner of the saloon. Seriously? Don't worry, he wasn't hurt. But we had to prop up the western wall with braces, and it took Dexter's construction company a month to get around to finishing the work. The insurance premium doubled. It was just taking a while to figure it all out. So it burned while he had no insurance. Nate clapped his hands, causing her to jump. He felt only mildly guilty. Now she's got it. Shall we move on? She tapped her nose as if she were considering it for a moment. Okay, she said finally. Wait, is room 11 like this too? 9, 11, and 12. All 4 of them, exactly the same. Except that room 12 still has a working bathroom. Wow. Yep. Adele attempted to smile. It quivered. It's just a lot to take in. Fixable, of course, I'm sure. What about the other rooms? Fixable his ass. He'd been trying to fix this shit for a long time now. Room 4 had a flood about a year ago. There's some old damage in the bathroom. Hugh had been waiting to repair that until the roof got fixed on the other side. Mold damage. Got into rooms 2 and 3, too. And room 6 has some termite problems. Some? Okay, a lot. And the front walls. We're assuming that's gotten into rooms 5, 7, and 8, but we haven't gotten Dexter to check yet. We didn't really want to know. Sure, She stood on the porch next to him, her eyes closed briefly. She looked just like she had on the covers of their albums, just as young. She had to be over 30 now, maybe 33. How did she pull off looking dewy and fresh and sweet when he, at 35, felt like his bones had too many miles put on them too fast? Then she said, "What about room 1? That was always my favorite anyway." "That's mine." "Really? What, it shouldn't be his?" "In exchange for working here. It comes out of my salary." It wasn't like he'd been ripping Hugh off, but he'd be damned if he would prove that to her. "Of course, I understand." She didn't. She didn't understand anything. Not yet. So next, but where do the guests stay? He looked at her face carefully to see if she was serious. "We don't have guests. We haven't had any in a long time." He felt his scowl form and didn't try to wipe it off. "You really don't know anything about the business anymore, do you?" "No guests at all?" "No." "But how—" Nate leaned back against a post and rubbed the tense spot between his shoulder blades. He probably looked like a bear scratching his back on a tree, but he didn't care. "How did he stay in business?" "Yeah, that's a question I've been trying to help him with for years." It was why he'd been working with the bank for more than a year. It was why he'd sold his boat to Ruth Ann. He'd been so damn close to buying the property. So close he could almost feel the deed in his hand. Hugh had almost given up hoping that his nieces would come back to Darling Bay and take over the property. "And I saw the cafe is closed too?" "Has been for years. Had to bring it up to a new code, and he never had the cash for that either." "Everything is fixable." "Wait till you see the fryer." "Let me guess, grease fire?" "2. So, you and your sisters own a dump." Whoa. Adele's face was pale, her eyes even brighter blue. The fog, just beginning to dissipate into wisps over the garden, revealed a blue sky that was just the same color. "Entropy is a bitch, huh?" It startled him enough that he laughed. He couldn't help it. So often he'd had the same thought, trying to keep up with the rundown plays with little cash and no time to do half the things he had on his daily to-do list. "What about the apartment over the saloon? Hugh's place?" Even though Nate had gone into this tour to burst the hometown girl's foolish bubble, not even he was looking forward to this part. "It's still there." "Can we go see it?" "You sure?" "Why?" She shot him a suspicious glance. "Did it burn up too?" "No." "Oh, God. Was that where he died?" "No." Hugh had dropped dead of a massive coronary right where he would have wanted, behind the varnished bar top mixing drinks while a pretty local gal, Sally Williams, sang on stage. He hadn't been breathing by the time Nate got to him, 30 seconds after Norma screamed. Even with CPR and the ambulance and Tox Ellis putting on the shock paddles and hauling Hugh to the hospital where they tried another couple of times, he'd never opened his eyes again. But it's where he lived, and that was bad enough. Adele shook her head, her hair flowing around her face like a shampoo commercial. Did she know it did that? Yeah, sure she did. She had to know exactly the effect her looks had on people, especially on men. Nate took a deep breath, resolving not to stare at her for one more second. He would barely glance at her. Maybe then he would notice how her breasts held up her shirt just right. "Come on," she said. "It can't be that bad. I mean, he was always a collector, right?" "Collector, huh?" Nate didn't want her to see it. He hadn't wanted anyone to. Before the lender came for the appraisal, he'd been going to hire a couple of guys and clean it out in one fell swoop. He tried to start on it one afternoon himself, but it had been too much. Just way too much. That's a nice way to put it. He wasn't a collector anymore. Just tell her, Houston, a hoarder is more like it. Show me? You sure? I don't think you know what you're getting into. She lifted her hands up and then let them drop. It's why I'm here. Okay, but remember, I didn't think we should do this. He wanted it to be on the record. I think you should just hire a crew to go in and clean. The Post Brothers, they've done this kind of work before. Adele walked past him so close the skin of her wrist almost brushed his. He pulled his arm back sharply. It can't be as bad as what I'm imagining now. she said. Chapter 5. Uncle Hugh's apartment, accessed by a steep set of stairs on the side of the main saloon building, looked okay on the outside. Sure, there were empty boxes and bags of recycling on the rear porch, but there was a picnic table that matched the ones downstairs in the patio garden and a grill that looked like it had gotten regular use. Nate trailed behind her on the way up. It had been obvious he'd almost enjoyed showing her how bad the hotel had become. When she'd spun in place under the tarps and met his gaze, he'd had a challenge locked behind his eyes. But he seemed miserable now. Is it unlocked too? No, that I keep locked, just in case. In case what? He cleared his throat with a rumble. I don't know. God, in case some kid thinks it's fun to break into a dead man's apartment and dies from some kind of environmental hazard. Here. Nate held the key out to her. He didn't even want to open the door himself. Adele felt a shiver of fear run under her skin, but she took it. Okay, here goes. I'll just sit out here, okay? Oh, no. Adele spun and grabbed his wrist. It was warm and wide and felt somehow electric. Embarrassed, she dropped it fast. I'm not going in without backup. Please? He sighed, but then nodded. She opened the door, and it was really beyond imagination. The door opened into the kitchen, but no one entering would have guessed that was what it was. Everything that made it a kitchen was invisible, up to and including the refrigerator. The room was full of newspaper, so full that Adele's first thought was how heavy that much paper must be. Was it even safe to stand here? Were they in danger of dropping through into the saloon below? That would be a pretty bad way to die, and her sisters would be so mad at her. Holy Tanya Tucker. Behind her, Nate snorted. She wasn't really sure how he managed it, since she herself was trying hard not to breathe. The room didn't smell rotten, exactly. It was different, as if the paper had gotten wet at some point and started to mold. It was mustily sweet and entirely unbearable. A narrow path was cut through the piles that in some places rose above her head. I don't understand. Where did he even get this many newspapers? Every Darling Bay Gazette ever printed, all the issues combined, wouldn't add up to this many. She ran out of breath and took an extra rapid one. I don't see. Is there even a stove in here? There used to be a stove. Adele made herself take a step or two into the room. She pushed down the wings of panic that beat in her chest. Yeah, it's under there still. I shut off the gas up here a year or two ago when I realized he was putting the papers on top of the stove. The pilot light made it too dangerous. He mostly ate outside at the grill. Are you claustrophobic? No? Good. But I might be soon. Yeah, that happens in here. Nate's voice was different now, less aggressive. Should I keep going? I don't think so. That was obvious. Is it like this all the way through? Each room is a little different. This is the paper room. Oh, God. Adele went forward to the doorway. To the right used to be a small bedroom where Hugh had always slept, and to the left was the bigger bedroom. When they were girls, their mom and dad would sleep in the parlor at the front of the apartment, and the girls would pile together in the king-sized bed in the bigger room. Now, Hugh's room, its door stuck permanently open, was full of... She couldn't even work it out at first. What is all of that? Buoys. Pardon? From floor to ceiling, the room was packed with shapes. It didn't make any sense. Most were round, like mannequin heads, but there were no faces. The windows were completely covered by them, so the only light that came in was from the doorway she stood in. I don't understand. From the water. Old ones. He liked the glass floats best, but those don't wash up that often. He'd get really excited about those. These are mostly the plastic kind. Some are styrofoam. So, that smell? I think it's seaweed and other gunk. But the way Adele remembered seaweed, it smelled good. It smelled green and salty, strewn on the tide-worn sand. This smelled rotten and sour. He didn't clean them before he threw them in here. He didn't think they needed it. I don't... What was he gonna do with them all? Nate yanked off his ball cap, revealing a head of thick, wavy brown hair, smashed half flat. He ran his hand over his face, then through his hair, standing it straight up. Then he jerked the cap back on, brim side forward this time. I must have asked him a million times. Sometimes he would say they were for a boat. Sometimes he would claim he was going to sell the glass ones on eBay, but he never did. The room pretty much filled up a couple of years ago, and since then he just kept shoving them in. Nate spoke over Adele's shoulder. He was so close to her that if she'd stepped backward, she would have run smack dab into him. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and locked her knees so they wouldn't lurch. This doesn't make sense. He collected beer cans, I remember that. Recalling that brought sense to the other smells, though, the under-scent of yeast and brine. Those are in another room. Am I right? He pointed behind him into the room she used to sleep in with her sisters. It was full of paper bags piled to her chest height. Each bag was overflowing with flattened cans. He started crushing them, at least. Before that, they wouldn't fit at all. He always said he was going to recycle them. These were the ones that wouldn't fit into his bin every week. He was going to bag them and take them in for cash, but as far as I know, he never even made one run. He wasn't a hoarder when we left. He wasn't one when I met him, but he sure as hell turned into one. Adele had seen enough TV shows on hoarding to know the mental disorder could be triggered by trauma. Uncle Hugh's brother, her father, had died. Would that have been enough to do it? They'd been close. And the girls themselves had scattered after that. None of them had ever come home to Darling Bay. Adele hadn't come because she thought it would make her too sad to be back in the place she'd been so happy, without her mother, without her father, without her sisters, who meant so much to her that every second without them hurt. What if Dad had done it? What if by staying away, they'd made their uncle actually sick? The very thought made her nauseated, and the apartment smell was such an assault, Adele wondered if she was going to throw up. She couldn't. There was no place to do so. And if she started, she doubted she'd be able to easily stop. What had crawled into those cans and died over the years? So many things could have gotten in and grown or reproduced. What's in the parlor? Oh, no, not beer bottles. I told him I'd put him in a home if he carried up the empty glass from the saloon. The floors wouldn't have held. I think he finally believed me about that. The parlor's full of books. Well, they smell less, anyway. Still heavy, though, and I'm worried about what could have crawled in under them. Bugs, mice, rats. Ugh. What about the bathroom? She'd seen the television shows. She knew what hoarders did to bathrooms. It's not as bad as you'd think. That's his magazine room. And the clawfoot tub has been too overflowing with them for years, but his shower and toilet are clean enough. He tried. Nate paused, sticking his hands into his pockets, as if he were nervous he'd touched something by accident. This is not trying. This was nothing but failing, on every single level. How was it possible that she and her sisters hadn't known how bad it had gotten? I think he tried hard, actually. He tried his ass off. I told him that if I came up to find he couldn't use his toilet, I was going to tell the zoning board. I came in once a month to make sure. Nate covered his face with his hand, then spoke around it. Can we get out of here now, please? Out. As soon as he said it, she wanted to climb over him, to kick and flail her way to the door, screaming all the way. Oh, sweet Loretta, yes, out. They stood on the patio. Adele pinched her nose and breathed through her mouth, 2 long, steadying breaths. How could this have happened to him? Instead of answering, Nate said, Loretta? Loretta Lynn. Of course. Nate seemed to accept this. He rolled his neck and then shrugged. He was old, no family to take care of him. Probably more common than we think. Sudden tears, fast and unwelcome, pressed against the backs of her eyes. Don't you dare. Uncle Hugh had still had family. Yes, they'd left. Everything had broken. They'd just been trying to put their lives back together ever since. He didn't say he needed us, not once. He didn't ask you to visit. Of course he did. He loved us. He wanted to see us, but we were always so busy. So sad. Her voice broke. He didn't say he needed us. Nate's voice was suddenly too loud, as if he'd been holding it back till now. And what was he supposed to do? He was too proud to admit he needed help, and besides, most days he didn't think he did. He should have been here the day I told him that it wasn't normal that a grown man slept on top of an old couch wrapped in a sleeping bag. It was like it hadn't occurred to him. That day, I thought he was going to cry, you know that? But he didn't. He just laughed it off the way he laughed everything else off, and he pulled another drink for someone he loved downstairs, and he told his stories, and you girls never came home. He lost everything over the years. Everything but the saloon, and he held on to it to share that, at least with you, and none of you ever came. Not one of you. Nate yanked at the latch of the porch umbrella, folding it halfway down and then springing it back up again, locking it in place. Grief warred with anger in Adele's chest. Uncle Hugh was gone. They'd all blown it. They knew it. They'd never get a chance to apologize. But this guy had no right. You know what? He fiddled with the umbrella latch. His scowl was deep, a long furrow creased across his brow. Yeah, it was a dare. He wanted her to come at him. She could feel it. And his anger diluted hers suddenly. He was correct. He was totally right. We should have come. Huh? You're right. That's all. She raised a shoulder and let it drop, hoping some of the tension would leave her neck. Lord, I guess I need to find a place to stay tonight. She saw it hit him. You thought you'd stay here tonight? In the hotel? Kind of. I thought you were going to stay in there. Nate pointed back towards the open door to Hugh's apartment. It's where we always stayed. I just made the mistake of thinking that things wouldn't change. That he still had a spare bed. To be fair, he probably does. Adele laughed in spite of herself. I bet you're right. It's in there somewhere. She shuddered. Can you imagine? He shook his head hard. Look, I'm sorry. You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. She let herself sit on the bench of the picnic table. Exhaustion flooded her, mixing with the guilt, creating a toxic, enervating sludge in her veins. You must be tired. It's a long drive. It's fine. Does Miss Clarkson still rent out rooms? Nate swung a leg over the opposite bench like it was a tiny horse. Not since she got busted for running them out by the hour. Ouch. In sweet little Darling Bay? Every place has its dirty secrets, even here. Adele looked back towards the apartment door. How many times had she and her sisters run in and out, letting the screen door slap closed behind them? Uncle Hugh would roar at them, a happy bear pretending and failing to be angry. They would just giggle and run faster. Hugh and Dad would sit right here. It was a different porch table they'd sat around then, a round one. Now it was rectangular. Dad was gone, 11 years now. Uncle Hugh was gone. Her sisters were far away, and Darling Bay had changed so much she'd gotten lost coming into town, ending up going the wrong direction on a one-way street for half a block. Luckily, it was still a sleepy town, and one old farmer in a beat-up pickup had honked at her to let her know, waving kindly at her as she did a panicked three-point turn. Nate cleared his throat. Want a beer? She laughed. No, thanks. I think the sun's nowhere near the yard arm, whatever that means. Hey, I run a saloon, no judgment. And look, you can still stay here. She looked around the upper patio. Where half the place has no roof, the other half has fallen apart. My room, last one standing. No, I'll grab a bag and clear out for you. I just put clean sheets on the bed today. No way, she said. I'm not kicking you out of your home. Nate shifted and planted his hands on his knees. I'm sorry, who owns the property now? That doesn't make it my home. Home was Nashville, wasn't it? The thought was so confusing it swept everything out of her mind except a blind feeling of dread. I've got a boat. Again, he didn't meet her eyes. Down at the marina. Sleep aboard. I'll head there for a few days while we get things sorted here. We. A muscle unkinked in her neck. Are you sure? Yep. He stood, unfolding to his full height. His shoulders were so wide they blocked the sun's glare. Chapter 6. As much as their mother's death had been foreseen, the terrifying chemo, the useless radiation, the longer goodbyes that meant everything and helped nothing, their father's death hadn't. Tommy Darling, healthy and in his prime, dropped dead of a massive heart attack. The Darling Songbirds had been in New York prepping for Madison Square Garden, the first stop on their biggest ever tour. They'd booked 42 shows around the globe, every single one sold out. The girls weren't opening for anyone, not anymore. They didn't need a bigger bill as a draw. No guest spots by Carrie Underwood, no Garth Brooks popping on stage to help them out. This was it. And their dad had very strong feelings about how the girls had made it. Your mama got to heaven and she started singing. Up there, they listen better than they do down here, and they started asking her what she knew about music, and she started pulling those strings. And that's why we are where we are today. We. He'd always said we when talking about the Songbirds. The tabloids had accused the sisters of being daddy's darlings, of living for his dreams. But even in that, they'd gotten it wrong. All four of them, the girls and Tommy, they'd always done it for Mama. For Tommy's darling Katie, the songbird who'd been too sad to find her voice. The original darling girl who'd lost her life before she had a chance to see her baby birds truly fly. The tabloids pulled the metaphors along as far as they could. Babies with no mother in the nest, Katie flying to heaven alone. But the truth was that the girls had never been lonely. Not once. Not until Tommy got that look of surprise while standing on the stage being built at Madison Square Garden. He'd had a mic in one hand and a cup of Dunkin' Donuts coffee in the other. He dropped the coffee, and that's what Adele remembered most from that moment. The way the coffee splashed across the stage and then back up, onto her cowboy boots and her sister's jeans. They'd all laughed a little at their father, a known klutz. Then he'd fallen, and he hadn't gotten up. The next night, Adele had made them go on stage. No one else was there to do it. They'd never bothered to hire a stage manager. Their father had been their stage manager since they'd first won that family band contest at the Tennessee State Fair. Sure, they had reps and 2 agents, and they had a production crew and the stage crew who were the best in the business. But both their parents were gone. That made Adele the oldest. I can't, Molly had gasped around sobs that morning. I won't. Lana, you know we have to. Lana had just shaken her head and parted the curtains of the sterile hotel room on the 36th floor that looked down at Times Square. Lana hadn't cried yet, and Adele knew she wouldn't, not for weeks, maybe months. Come on, Adele said. He would want us to. Don't you dare, said Molly. He wouldn't. Adele heard the air conditioning kick a notch higher, which didn't make sense, and she was freezing. They all were. She could see the goosebumps on Molly's arms, and Lana's shoulders were hunched forward as she stared out the window. This is what he worked for. We all worked for it, Lana shrugged. Now he's dead. So we give up? Lana rounded on her, the drapes scudding close like heavy clouds. He died yesterday. Give us a fucking break. We don't get one of those. Oh? Lana's eyebrows were high. The show must go on. You're gonna push that shit on us now? Adele's legs felt hollow. You bet your ass it does. Let us bury the man. It's too late to refund 18,000 people. We could have pulled the plug yesterday, but not today. Lana's face was white, except for the 2 red spots high in her cheeks. Did you actually just say pulled the plug? Wrong words. They were all the wrong words. 42 cities, 10 weeks. We can do this. Daddy put this all together. He's never been more excited about anything, ever. You know that. We get up there tonight. We show the world we're stronger than they ever knew. We sing for him. We sing for Mama. They're together for the first time in 6 years. Tonight they can watch our show together. You think that's not the one thing they'd both want? The thing was, Adele believed her own words. So did her sisters. She could see it. Molly turned over on the hotel couch, her shoulders shaking. Lana stormed out of the room, muttering something about the vending machine. That night, they went on stage. The normally dazzling lights were brighter than ever, and reporters with their press badges were packed so tightly against the edges of the stage, Adele thought they must be holding it up. They were all there, waiting for them to fail, for the girls to fall apart in front of God and everyone else. And they did exactly that. Molly fainted, collapsing in the middle of Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. On a stage where everything was vibrating with noise, even with her back turned as she sang stage left, Adele felt the thunk of it travel up her legs. There, right where their father had fallen, lay Molly, bleeding from the head. Lana, who had been slow and sluggish for the last hour, as if high on something, dropped her mic and rushed forward. Molly was coughing then, her lids fluttering. Lana held Molly's head in her lap as the flashbulbs beat against their skin. And Adele kept singing. It was unforgivable. Wait till your father gets home. Just a little longer now. I swear to the moon above, he'll be home soon, my love. She knew later she should have shut down the show. 3 words cut the sound. Those 3 words would have killed the show and the tour, as dead as their father. Idiotically, she thought she could still fix it. Molly would stand, and Lana and she would hold their sister up and finish the final lines together. He'll be home soon, my love. But they didn't. She sang the last line as 2 paramedics in blue raced across the stage. The lighting wobbled, and for an impossible moment, Adele tried to remember what the next song was. Then she knew. The show was over. The tour was done before it even really started. We're sorry. She apologized to the world. She didn't know until later how much those few sentences had destroyed her sisters. They were played on national media over and over. Molly flat on the stage, Lana darkly furious, Adele apologizing. She should have been hiding them, folding them under her wings, protecting them. Instead, she'd shoved them on stage, and in doing so, she'd broken their wings, snapping each one. The Darling Songbirds were done. We're so sorry, she said. Adele heard people in the audience crying. She touched her earjack, but heard nothing but a low whistle. A reporter at her knee shouted something at her. He had tears streaming down his face, and Adele couldn't quite figure out why. The chime of Adele's phone lifted her out of the memory, or the dream. She laid down to nap, and now she was panting, sweat dripping at her hairline. She was confused for a moment until she remembered where she was, in the bartender's borrowed bed. Light was still coming in through the parted curtains, but just barely. She could see pink and orange in the sunset-lit clouds. The chime was a text from Molly, finally. Root beer floats? I only like Coke floats. Adele smiled. That was right. Oh, yeah. Remember when I was on that diet when I was 15 and I only liked Diet Coke floats? With sherbet because it was low fat. Disgusting. How's it going there? Also disgusting. Question mark? Adele fell backward on the bed, holding the phone above her, trying to ignore that the whole room smelled like Nate. Like wood chips and soap and something spicy, like cloves. This whole place is awful. The hotel is wrecked. Fire, mold, termites, ruin. Basically every single plague of the Bible has landed between rooms 2 through 12. Seriously? And Uncle Hugh was a hoarder. Again, she wondered if they'd triggered that change. Guilt tasted like acid at the back of her throat. No point in sharing the worry with Molly, though. I'm gonna have to hire a backhoe to dig his apartment out. The cafe looks like it's been closed so long we might have been his last customers. The saloon is open, but barely. Shit. Yeah. Well, if anyone can fix it, it's you. Adele felt a weariness settle into the base of her bones. I guess. Where are you staying, then? The bartender's room is the only good one. You kicked out the bartender? He offered. Is he hot? Adele's thumbs hovered over the phone's keyboard. She shouldn't answer it truthfully. that the guy could make the polar ice caps melt just by hitting them with that dark stone-colored smolder. OMG, I knew it. I didn't say anything. You paused. That's all you needed to do. What's he like? Oh, Molly. Always on the lookout for love and finding it more often than not. She just didn't pick the right ones. Ever. He's rude, ugly, super old. Bull. She looked around the room. It had only taken Nate a few minutes to pack a duffel bag of jeans and shirts and whatever it was in the small bathroom that smelled like cloves. He'd only taken one of the 2 guitars with him. He'd left a Martin, an old one that she was dying to try. She'd propped her own guitar up in its case next to it. Let's leave it at this. His name is Nate, and he plays guitar. You're doomed. Adele laughed. You like the bad boys, not me. Speaking of which, how's Rick? An asshole, like all the others. I'm off men forever. For a week. How long are you on board this time? Adele didn't even know where her sister was, which ocean she was currently in. Her whereabouts changed so fast it didn't even warrant keeping up on it anymore. One week, Molly would be in Alaska watching icebergs calve. The next, she'd be pulling into port in Puerto Rico, dispensing eating advice to people who would nod agreeably and then ignore her completely, hitting up the buffet tables like they were about to starve to death. Molly said being a nutritionist on a cruise ship was like being an abstinence counselor at an orgy. A week. We hit Sicily and then head to Greece. I hate you. You should. It's not snowbirds this time. It's some singles hookup thing, younger and cuter. Adele couldn't even imagine the trouble Molly could get into on a cruise like that. Use protection. Oh, stop. What time is it there? 8 p.m., I think? After Nate had handed over his room key, Adele had looked around the room for something to do. Usually, that something was easy to find, even in a hotel room. Adele could always find something to clean, to straighten. The amount of satisfaction she got from making pictures hang perfectly straight was almost physical. Once, in a room in Miami, the air conditioner had stopped working, and she'd fixed it with just a bobby pin and some Scotch tape. But Nate's room was perfectly clean. It was orderly, too, but only because he didn't seem to have many possessions. He had an old PC laptop on top of the small desk and the guitars. In the drawer next to the bed was a single pair of earplugs, still in plastic wrap. Who was this guy? Adele had given up trying to figure it out and had gone down to the marina and hiked out to the headland to say hello to Darling Bay. It had been a family tradition when she was little, back when both her mother and father were alive. If Mama was feeling bright enough, they'd hike all the way out, all 5 of them, her father carrying little Lana, her mother picking flowers and leading them singing old country tunes, Johnny Cash being her favorite. When they got to the point where the cliff jutted out and the wind blew stronger than anywhere else, where they could see the whole town, they stopped. They all waved hello. That's the town your great-grandfather built. Look at it now, all twinkly and perfect. The memories had made her heart ache, but sweetly. Still following darling tradition, she'd gotten a burger at Roper's, sitting outside and watching the seagulls fight with the fishermen coming in with their catches. With a full belly, she'd come back and collapsed onto room 1's creaky old bed. She tried not to imagine the way Nate might have made it creak. She'd napped almost a full 3 hours. You have to go down to the saloon. She texted back. And do what? Have a beer with a cute guitar player. I should be working. This isn't a vacation. Right now? Come on. When is your next song due? Adele touched the tip of her nose. Molly was a human lie detector. Not for a month. Plenty of time for you to sell the place, and plenty of time for you to have fun. Not that much fun. I meant in the sack. I know what you meant. Doing the dirty, getting busy, knocking boots. Get it on. Adele felt her cheeks heat as she tried not to laugh. She wanted to say, I love you. I miss you. I need you here with me. But she and her sisters were careful not to talk like that. It hurt too much. We're not all like you, Molly. More's the pity, too. Hey, I've got a client in a sec. Go get him, Tiger. XO. You too. Adele sat up. She looked down at the black shirt that was stained from where she dropped mayonnaise on it from her burger. Should she change? No. It was just the saloon she'd grown up in. She shouldn't care what she was wearing. But then she swapped the dirty black shirt for a clean white one and ran a comb through her hair, cursing herself as she did. Come on. Concern for her appearance didn't mean anything except that she was courteous to others. That's what she told herself, anyway. She couldn't quite figure out an excuse for why she felt compelled to slick on the pink lip gloss that one record exec had told her made her look like an angel about to fall. So she just pressed her lips together and stopped trying to come up with one. Chapter 7. So, when were you planning on telling me? Hank Coffey sat at the bar, twirling a coaster between his fingers. Nate frowned and slid a Mountain Dew down to Angela Murphy, who didn't drink but liked hearing Parrot Freddy's travel stories as much as she liked stroking Ethel's vibrant wing. Telling you what? About the girl? What girl? Hank snorted. I'm halfway tempted to keep going with this to see how long you'll pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. But I have this weird feeling you could keep it going way longer than I would find amusing. Possibly. So? Nate raised one eyebrow and remained quiet. Okay, I have to say it, huh? Fine, but you're totally buying my next beer. Sure. Hank never had more than one anyway, and Nate wasn't going to say it. Adele, darling. Funny, her name had always gotten to him. When Hugh had talked about his nieces, the Darling Songbirds, Nate had always thought Adele's name was the prettiest, the most songbird-like. Turns out he was right. He didn't need to see the other ones in person to know that she had to be the easiest on the eye out of the defunct group. That fall of honey hair, those eyes that looked bedroom ready, even when she was just standing there, asking questions he didn't want to answer. What about her? Hank slapped his coaster on his knee. I knew it. You don't know crap. She's back in town to take over the saloon. No way. It was a knee-jerk response. She was in town to sell. She had to be. Then what? Her sister's coming? I didn't ask her family's itinerary. Nate lifted a hand at Mac, the drummer in the band. Hank twisted, looking behind him as if hoping to find Adele there. But that's what she's doing, right? She said something about selling it. Oh, man. Hank leaned forward. Did you tell her you were gonna buy it? She's grieving, man. I just showed her around. Hank was right, though. It should have been the first damn thing out of his mouth. You promised me I could buy the place. You gonna honor that? Loser. She's still as pretty as she always was. Nate ducked his head to look over Hank's shoulder. Be careful that Samantha doesn't hear you ask that, buddy. Ah, Sam's good. She knows there's no woman prettier than her in the whole damn world. Hank grinned. Hank and Samantha were the happiest couple he knew, and it seemed genuine. Highly irritating, too. Hank and Nate were close, had been since Hank had been on the paramedic crew that transported Nate's mother to the hospital after one of several overdoses. But no matter how close they could claim to be, Hank and Samantha were each other's favorites in all things. Just plain annoying. She coming? Hank nodded. She'll be here soon. You didn't answer my question about the Darling girl. She's all right, I guess. Yeah, fine, if you like that kind of thing. Something happened to Hank's face, as if he knew a joke that Nate didn't know the punchline to yet. What kind of thing is that? Brown hair, blue eyes, pretty as a picture? Nate shook his head, trying to rid his head of the image of Adele's face when she'd first seen the courtyard and how pretty it was. She'd lit up, just like the strings of white lights that were illuminated out there now. No, her hair's not brown. It's more like, not quite blonde, more like dirt-colored. Like the last inch of a warm Hefeweizen someone left in a pint glass. Hank snorted. Yeah. And her eyes, they're not really that blue. Mm-hmm. More like a foggy day kind of blue. He'd seen them change color, as she'd look first at the courtyard and then into Hugh's disaster zone. No, more like smog, dirty blue. You say dirty about her a lot. Well, Nate shrugged, if the shoe fits. Dirty. The voice was Adele's, and it came horrifyingly from behind him. It was too late to save himself, and he knew it. Adele's eyes snapped, her gorgeous wisteria eyes, nothing like dirty blue anything. But something like a smile was fighting her mouth. She hit his upper arm with her fist. It was softer than a real punch, but harder than a play tap. I have dirty beer here. Smog? She didn't. She'd done something to it, maybe just combed it out so that it flowed over her shoulders in soft waves. Her white t-shirt clung to her curves, and Nate had to actively counsel himself to remove his eyes from the V of the fabric. I like Hefeweizen, he said weakly. And, pollution gets a bad rap. Why are you sneaking in the back, anyway? No one does that. Hey, said Hank. Isn't this your new boss, Nate? The one you were telling me about? The slave driver's gonna ruin everything, right? Dude, started Nate, but then Adele was around him and on the other side of the bar, wrapping her arms around Hank. There you are, she said, kissing him on the cheek. Nate felt some kind of jealousy spark, an empty lighter clicking uselessly. You're even prettier now, you know that? Exactly the opposite of what Nate was just telling me. Hey, but Adele just laughed. Where's Samantha? Congrats on finally getting your girl, by the way. I loved the Facebook post of the wedding, and I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I can't believe you really dressed up in your big duct tape head to walk down the aisle. Sam taught self-defense, and Hank was one of her padded instructors on his days off in the fire department. I can't believe the first thing my brand new wife did was kick me in the garage. Hank laughed happily. She's coming down as soon as she closes the studio. Should be soon. Both of our schedules, we haven't had a Friday night date in a while. We're gonna watch Dusty and Rusty play, and maybe I'll make you shoot some pool with us. Molly was the shark, not me. I seem to remember you weren't bad. Adele bit her bottom lip, and Nate wondered if that lip gloss he couldn't stop staring at was a controlled substance. That was a long time ago. We were all so young then. Hank laughed. I still remember your favorite drink from when you were, 21? Her voice was soft. I was 22 when we left. Yeah, and then it was that horrible Clamato stuff poured in a bud. That's the most embarrassing thing anyone's ever said about me. And the tabloids have rumored that I've been kidnapped by sex trafficking aliens. Her gaze flickered to Nate, and he felt his stomach jump. He probably just hadn't eaten in a while. That was it. He grabbed a bag of salt and vinegar chips, the least popular of the bags he sold. He didn't like them much either, but maybe they'd settle this case of nerves he was feeling. He chewed and then said, can I get you a drink? He felt, rather than saw, the chip fly out of his mouth and land on the bar. Smooth. Hank guffawed, but Adele pretended not to notice. Sure, how about a Hefeweizen? Well, what do you know? Nate grabbed a pint glass. Those just happened to be on the house tonight. What a stunning coincidence, said Adele. She pulled up a bar stool and sat, leaning comfortably against Hank. So, y'all know each other, said Nate, adding stupid to his repertoire of clumsy and verbally challenged. Small town, said Adele. She and Hank shared a private smile. I'd just never held a candle to his dream girl. No way. Her and Hank? How many times had Hank and Nate sat around listening to Hugh talk about his perfect songbird nieces, and Hank had never said a word to Nate? What the hell was that about? I'm gonna go grab some glasses. Holler if anyone needs me. It was an excuse. At least once a night, usually more, he had to do a sweep of the saloon and of the outdoor courtyard, picking up pint glass empties and dumping them into a bus tub. It was still early enough that he hadn't even come close to running out yet. He'd be lucky if he came back with more than 3 glasses total, but he had to get away. Hey, Rich, how's it going? You're not done with that? I hear you. Gladys, you need me to grab that? Gladys held on to the dribble left in her glass and glared at him. Still drinking. Hey, is that a darling girl over there? You never know. I'd hoped he could get away with just that, but Gladys's fingers grabbed his shirt, crab-like and sharp. I do know. She's here now. Missed the funeral, didn't she? All of them did. That one's Adele? Didn't really notice. He lied. Maybe a refill on that? Gladys let go of him. Oh, that'd be good. Thanks, sugar. Get the gossip for us, huh? You bet. Never. The funeral. Had it really been necessary for her to mention that? Nate's mood dropped just thinking of the day. A rare summer storm had swept in the morning they'd put Hugh in the Darling Bay Cemetery. And instead of being a short and warm rain shower, it had been cold and dark, completely appropriate under the circumstances. The weather had grieved like Nate had. Thunder had rocked the bay, and lightning had started a couple of vegetation fires in the valley, so the 2 entire fire companies who'd been in attendance had to race away before it was over. He would have gotten such a kick out of them being at the service. He'd always loved the fire department's drum and piper corps. He would have thought it was funny as hell that Earl Cornejo had to stop bagpiping right in the middle of Amazing Grace to run out to the fire engine. But Nate hadn't thought it was humorous at all. It had broken his heart, really. It had been the first time he'd cried in public since his mother had struck him across the face in a grocery store when he was 5, knocking him backward into the shopping carts. He had learned from her not to cry, that life was too hard to give in to it. And Hugh had been the one to teach him that life was too good not to give in to laughter. How about you, Randy? Ready to let that glass go? No? Okay. Nate hurried past the end of the bar, trying to shut his ears to whatever Hank and Adele were talking about. Not hard when the Darling Songbirds' second album seemed to be playing all the way through at full volume. Whoever had queued that up on the jukebox either had a good sense of humor or no tact at all. Nate would bet on the latter. He eyed the front. No new customers. With perfect timing, Dixie made her way through the swinging half door. Thank God. She was technically his second bartender on Friday and Saturday nights. She covered him when he took breaks or played with the band. He gave her a long, distant salute, and she returned it with a snap. Nate escaped through the storeroom and out the side door to the back courtyard. With any luck, no one had seen him leave. With a little more luck, no one would look for him for a while. It felt like a lot, all of a sudden. Adele back in town, Hugh gone forever. He wanted to breathe the night air by himself for a few long seconds before he had to get on stage. It wasn't until he was sitting on the first long bench that he remembered the last time he'd sat out here. Chapter 8. Nate and Hugh had sat out on the saloon's back courtyard a million, maybe more, times, under the twinkling lights of the white strands and the stars above, both. Hugh had sometimes lit his battered old pipe, but Nate was fine sitting on one of the benches with open hands, just looking up. The night before Hugh had died, they'd had a surprisingly quiet Thursday night, and the saloon was completely empty at 10 o'clock. They'd sat out there, watching the stars blink at them. No fog, so cool they'd both needed their jeans jackets. As if Hugh had known he was on the way out, he'd said something that hadn't made sense until later. Hey, kid, I know you want this place. Yeah, Nate had said, smiling upward. He did, ever since he'd been able to talk Mariah at the bank into believing he was a good bet. Well, he'd had to sell his boat to Ruth Ann to bring his points all the way and have the cash for the down payment, but it had been the right thing to do. He could feel it. The money was there, ready. He could buy the place as soon as Hugh told him he could have it. Keep fighting for it. Hugh had said he would sell, and then changed his mind an hour later so many times that Nate wasn't going to believe it until the deed was in his hand. Hugh kept thinking the girls might come back, claim their inheritance. But everyone knew the Darling Songbirds had flown away forever. Otherwise, they would have come home sooner. You want me to keep fighting you for the place? Okay, then. But don't tell me you didn't ask for a battle, old man. I mean it, Nate. No joke. If I'm not around, do what you have to do. Had Hugh known? Had he felt, even then, that his life was drawing to a close? Had he foreseen Adele coming back to town in order to sell the one thing that Nate held important? If so, why hadn't Hugh just sold it to him? None of it felt fair, but that wasn't news. Nate had learned a long time ago that life didn't play by the rule book. And now he'd lied to Adele about still having the boat. What was he supposed to do, suggest they share the small room? His neck and something else, something lower, heated at the thought. He'd just toss his sleeping bag in room 12 where the bathroom still worked. It'd be fine, even without a roof overhead, like camping. Nate collected the 6 ashtrays that rested on top of the picnic tables, stacking them to bring inside to wash. Then he realized they were all clean and unused, so he set them out again. There was absolutely no reason for him to be out here in the twinkle-lighted dark. This was just him running away. But hell, what was the harm in that? It's prettier out here than it ever was. Adele's voice was soft behind him. I love the lights, how they sparkle through the grapevines. Was she going to make this a habit? Sneaking up behind him and sending goosebumps up and down his spine? If so, Nate didn't like it. Yeah, thanks. He looked over her shoulder. Do I have a customer? I don't think so, she said. And there's someone bartending now. Short brown curls. He didn't have to tell her anything about how he ran the bar until she actually asked. Yeah, well, I should get back in there. They could smell Adele's perfume, light as a butterfly's wing and sweet as jasmine. And his head did a dizzy reel. He slid his right hand into his front pocket and gripped his mother's 2-month sobriety chip, just long enough to settle his head. Too bad she never got her 3-month chip. Women. He'd believed in his mother too many times. Hugh had believed in his darling songbirds way too many times. Wait. But Nate was fast, moving around the last table and through the storeroom, back into the saloon before she could finish what she was saying. Scrugg was almost finished setting up the amp on stage, and Mac was checking the microphones. 1, 2. Can y'all hear me? There were a couple of new customers seated at the bar, but Dixie had them well in hand, whipping up some frothy concoction while telling them a joke at the same time. Adele took her seat next to Hank at the bar. She looked at him expectantly. So, tell me about the band. Hank hooted. Yeah, Nate, tell her about the band. Shut up. Adele sat forward eagerly. Are you in it? I saw your guitars. I really wanted to play your Martin, but I didn't dare touch it. Looks like an antique. He wasn't going to get out of this, was he? This was the way his night was going to go. The owner of the Golden Spike was going to watch its bartender play guitar on a broken-down stage in a podunk town, and that bartender was just going to have to take it. It's as old as I am, maybe older. Must be worth a fortune. Her voice was soft, but he could clearly hear her through the noise in the saloon. It's a piece of crap. The Martin had been his mother's beater guitar, given to her by the man he'd suspected, but never confirmed, was his father, and it had always been passed around to the drunkest person in the room. It was the guitar that could take a licking, and it wasn't worth more than a couple $100, despite its age and provenance. Plays for shit. Sounds terrible. Why do you keep it, then? Sentimental reasons wasn't a good answer. Same reason I keep her chip in my pocket. Might need firewood someday. Hank said, don't let him fool you. Nate could make a necklace guitar sound great. You're good, huh? Her smile looked real, and it made Nate itch. I guess I don't suck that much. The door swung open and Samantha walked in. Thank God for small mercies. Hey, Hank, look who's here. Hank lit up like someone put a quarter in him. There's my girl. Samantha laughed and kissed him roundly. Nate watched, a little embarrassed, but unable to look away from their happiness, like it was a car wreck, only the exact opposite. A collision that ended in joy. He met Adele's eye, and then wished he hadn't. There was something in her gaze, something soft and wistful, and there was nothing he could do about that, nothing he wanted to do. So he drew a pint of Samantha's favorite beer and slid it across the bar. Hey, Sam, when you come up for air, look who's here. Samantha and Hank pulled apart, both blushing. Or maybe they had both just overheated. Sorry. Samantha turned to Adele. Oh! They hugged quickly. It's been a long time, said Adele. So long. I loved your third album. It was the soundtrack of my life for a while. Thanks, said Adele. Do you get this wherever you go? No way. In every town except Darling Bay, no one knows me from Eve. Wait, I take that back. A couple of weeks ago, I was recognized, and it was very exciting, but then I realized she thought I was Lorelai Gilmore from the Gilmore Girls, and obviously not, and both of us ended up very embarrassed. Samantha laughed. Did you have a cup of coffee in your hand? I did. That's where the resemblance began and ended. No, I can see it. Samantha wrinkled her nose. Totally, you've got that vibe. And hey, look, Nate looks like Luke Danes, doesn't he? She nudged Hank in the side. Don't you think? I will never admit that I watched that show with you. Samantha nodded solemnly. Then I will never tell anyone that you're the one who bought the DVDs in the first place. Nate leaned forward, hands on the bar. I have no idea what you're talking about, but this staring at me thing has to stop, so somebody change the subject for the love of God. Adele came to his aid. When does your band go on? Not for at least 3 or 4 hours, said Nate. Maybe she would give up and go to bed immediately. And just like that, he imagined her in his bed, under his sheets. What did Adele wear to sleep? A white camisole? A red nightie? Nothing at all? Matt gave a howl from the stage while beating on the drum's hi-hat. Nate jumped. Or no. Maybe we could go on now. Adele's grin was huge. Excellent. For the first time in more years than he could count, Nate felt a surge of stage fright. He hated it. Chapter 9. Adele couldn't remember the last time she'd just watched a band play for fun. A band in which she had no investment, made up of members to whom she had no ties. She hadn't written the song for the lead singer, she hadn't introduced one of the members to her old publicist, and no one was trying to ride her now threadbare coattails. Nashville was huge and bright, a Tinseltown honky-tonk. Darling Bay was sleepy, and Adele already knew the band would be done by 11. The city noise ordinance had always been respected. Darling Bay liked its peace and quiet. Adele had nothing to do in the saloon, no job at all. She was just there, watching a country band play for an old wooden bar full of people. Okay, maybe full wasn't the word. There were a dozen, at most 15 people. Surely more would show up later. It was Friday night, after all. The few who were there, though, were singing along to the songs they obviously knew and loved. They were good songs, too. On the surface, they were lightweight, standard country fare, but each song had a second hard punch on the way back. The bottle leaves me lost, empty, untrue, and baby, it still don't act as bad as you. The songs were original. She knew that much. She would have known if they were covers. There were only 3 members in Dust and Rusty. Samantha pointed at the drummer. That's Mac. He was a skinny man with dark sunglasses, full-sleeve tattoos, and a thick, dark mustache. He looks a little scary, but he's actually a third-grade teacher. Mac grimaced furiously and hit a double-stroke roll. He looks like he could eat a live chicken. Well, he has chickens, so I guess it's possible, but he treats them all like his babies, so I kind of doubt it. He raises buff Orpingtons and helps out with the chicken section of 4-H. Don't ask him about egg production unless you want your ear bent right off your head. He never shuts up about them. And that guy there, the bass player, that's Scrugg Watson. He's a strawberry farmer. Got a place about 4 miles out of town. Scrugg didn't look anything like a farmer from his neck down. He wore a gray suit and a button-down shirt so white it gleamed almost blue under the spotlight. A wide burgundy tie was tucked in place, and his black wingtips shone. But from the neck up, he was all agriculture. Wide, windburned cheeks, eyebrows blonde from the sun, and a red John Deere baseball cap. They were good. They had a clean, traditional sound, Scrugg doing most of the singing, with Nate and Mac backing him on tight harmonies. Their third song was about a pickup truck and a blonde, and while they were the ultimate country song cliches, something about the tune worked. She was impressed. Scrugg could really sing. Mac could really drum. Nate could play, yes. He played damn well, but beyond that, no one on God's green earth should be allowed to have that much natural charisma. Adele couldn't tear her gaze away from him. On stage, under the bright light, his scowl turned less cranky and more sexy. He wore a blue t-shirt and jeans that fit his long legs just right. He'd been good-looking enough in the backward-facing baseball cap he'd worn earlier, but he was completely devastating in the beat-up brown cowboy hat that he wore now. When he tilted his head to glance at the fretboard, shadows leaped along his strong, broad jaw. The way his left hand skated up and down the strings made something in the pit of Adele's stomach twist. He kept those loose legs that the good players had, his knees slightly bent, his jeans tight over his thighs. He made playing look easy, and Adele knew from years with her own guitar that the things he was doing were anything but. Damn. She needed another drink, or a water, or maybe just a break from staring at the guitarist. What was she, 18? At the bar, she ordered a sparkling water from Dixie, the woman with the short brown curls. She was pretty, built like a sexy fire hydrant, short but curvy, the slants of her body exaggerated. She wore a black, low-cut top that showed off her cleavage, and her lower curves meandered out of the hem of her jean shorts. We seem to be fresh out of the sparkling stuff. Sorry. I've got soda water or Coke. Soda water. Twist a lime? Dixie nodded, and when she turned back with the drink, she said, we never have the sparkling stuff, right? Uncle Hugh was always a stick in the mud when it came to mixology. Dixie snorted. Mixo what? One night a guy came in here and tried to tell Hugh his old-fashioned recipe was wrong, that he needed to heat the sugar cube before dropping it in. Adele could only imagine. Hugh had a big heart and a short fuse. And he made it just like he always did, ignoring the asshole as he whined, then carried it to him around the bar. He was seated right where you are now. Hugh held it over his head, and the best part was the guy just looked upward like he had no idea what was coming next. He dumped it. Dixie grinned. All over him. The guy threatened to sue him for the damage to his clothes, and that's when Hugh threw him and his 3 friends out, physically. You know how he could roar into grizzly bear mode? That version of Hugh came out to play. I swear the guy was almost sobbing. We laughed for weeks over that one. Adele squeezed the lime into the soda water. You could insult him just about any way you wanted to, but you couldn't insult the way he ran the bar. Dixie nodded in satisfaction. Exactly right. Hey, my sincere condolences to you. I can't imagine what it must be like to be back without him here to greet you. Was there a concealed barb in the words? A cloaked judgment for not getting there in time? But nothing seemed to hide behind Dixie's words. Nothing except clear and rather heart-twisting sympathy in her eyes. For the first time since pulling into town, Adele felt like crying. Felt the heat behind her eyes that told her if she didn't do something quick, she'd be blubbering in the saloon she'd practically grown up in. She glugged some of the soda water, grateful for its coldness. So, how long did you work for him? Me? Not that long. The last year and a half, I think. Adele pushed her hair back and looked over her shoulder at the band. They were playing a sweet ballad about when to call your sweetheart and what you should call her when you did, and Nate took a short solo on the chorus. His voice was strong, his words clearly enunciated. Gravel lined his low voice, and he was perfectly on pitch. His voice was so good, it was almost annoying, and his playing was even better. She hadn't expected this. With a little more effort than it should have taken, Adele turned back to Dixie. Yeah, what brought you here? What else? Love. Always a good reason to go somewhere, said Adele. Not always the best reason to stay, though. Mm-hmm. Adele sneaked another look over her shoulder at Nate. She couldn't help saying, he's good. He's really good. Yeah, I hear that a lot from women on your side of the bar. Adele started. Really? Laughing, Dixie pulled a beer for a guy in an improbable corduroy blazer and then came back. Yeah, he gets a lot of that, what's a guy like you doing in a place like this? Adele nodded. She could see that. And she couldn't help wondering how he answered. Samantha and Hank were slow dancing on the small floor occupied by a few other couples. Samantha's head was on Hank's shoulder, and they moved like they were listening less to the music than to each other's bodies. Did Nate ever slow dance like that with anyone? Was there a girl he regularly danced with? Hey, I just have to say, Dixie leaned over the bar, displaying even more friendly cleavage. Your first album? That one was my favorite. Everyone liked Take It Slow on the Curves best, but the first one, even with its rough production, that one got me through some rough times, Oh, man. Dixie clapped a red-nailed hand over her mouth. I shouldn't have said that. I love the production on it. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, I swear. The production on that one was rough. We did it in our parents' garage with equipment we borrowed from a college kid who lived down the block. When we first recorded it, we didn't even have a band name. It wasn't until we came to Darling Bay that summer that Uncle Hugh came up with it. Dixie nodded, looking satisfied. He never stopped bragging that the name had been his idea. The Darling Songbirds was fine for what they were back then. But now it was as old-fashioned as the town itself. Earlier, when that old album had been playing on the jukebox, Adele had had to swallow the urge to sing along with Honey and Honky Tonk. She hadn't performed with her sisters in 11 years, but she could sing those songs in her sleep. The slow song ended. Nate stepped out at the light. Hank and Samantha came off the floor. Samantha had said something to Dixie in a low voice that Adele couldn't hear, and both the women laughed. It wasn't about her, was it? Fresh nerves jumped through her. Hank held out his hand to Adele. Dance with me while they gab? With relief, Adele said, Love to. As long as it had been since she'd hung out in a country saloon simply listening to music for the fun of it, it had been even longer since she'd danced on a bare wood floor. The next song was a two-step. Adele had forgotten how reliable a dancer Hank was. He had the rhythm, and what he lacked in panache he made up with sheer good-heartedness. When the band broke into a slower song in three-quarter time next, he held on to her and they moved into waltz steps. You're the same guy, Adele said, only happy. You didn't used to be that. You only knew me when I was hung up on a certain girl. Adele laughed. You mooned over Samantha, and she never saw you. I totally remember that. You were the most sentimental thing I ever met. But if you haven't noticed, these days, that certain girl seems pretty hung up on you, too. Yep, said Hank simply. We're happy. Adele, unable to help herself, glanced at the three men on stage. Nate had a slight grin, and he was looking down at his guitar as if it were the love of his life. And maybe it was. I'm so glad. What about you? Did you cart a man along with you into town, or is he coming along behind you? No, man, Adele said lightly as Hank wheeled her carefully around an elderly couple who were dancing with a steady but glacial pace. Just me. I thought I read that you were hooked up with that singer. I was in Nashville. I'm a songwriter. Singers happen. Hey, now. Hank pulled away and looked at her. You okay? How was it possible to feel these two ways at the same time? She was so happy to be here, to be dancing with Hank on the wooden floor she loved sliding across in socks when she was a kid and the bar was empty. At the same time, she was devastated that she'd missed saying goodbye to her uncle. I'm okay. She glanced again at Nate. And for 1 second, as he strummed a D minor seventh, he smiled at her. Their gaze tangled and she lost her breath, and then Hank was turning her again, and she had to look into his face to stay steady on her feet. What are you gonna do about Nate? What? Did it show that much? Was she really that obvious? She used to be smoother than that when she was checking someone out in a dark bar. But it had been a long time. Keep him? Fire him? Are you selling the place? Oh, that. Because you should sell to him, you know. Sorry? I'm glad you're back, don't get me wrong, I really am, but Nate loves this place, and he tried so hard to buy it off your uncle. I hate that he didn't get the chance, and now he might not get to. He wants to buy it? He's been saving for years. I know the bank loan came through again more than a year ago, but Hugh was in one of his phases where he thought he might redo everything here and start over. You know how he was. Bigger than life. Adele's father had always said his brother could talk a whore into saying the rosary. Why does he want it? And if he wants it, why didn't Uncle Hugh just sell to him? Not really sure. From a couple of things Nate has said, I think Hugh might have been using this place as bait. For us. But they'd never come. Hank gave a quick nod. Maybe. I just hope you think about giving Nate a chance. Adele was suddenly suspicious. Did he put you up to this? Nashville had been like this. There was always someone ready to sweep you off your feet so they could try to get what they thought they needed from you. But she hadn't expected that kind of thing here. Of course not. I'm just curious for his sake. He's a good friend, and I don't want him to go anywhere. I haven't actually talked it out with my sisters. Not yet, but we obviously can't keep this place. Yeah. Hank pushed her into another spin, and she landed against him with a more solid thud than she'd planned. It's a wreck, she said. Totally. Trashed. He showed you the rooms? What's not burned out is dry rotted. Yep. Hank nodded amenably. And the saloon is as run down as they get. Surprised the boards aren't dropping us to the dirt below right now. Hank gave a satisfied stomp with his boot. And the cafe is defunct. Has been for years, old and moldy. Not the coffee. Remember, people came from miles around just to get a cup to go? And the barbecued oysters still fresh in the water every Saturday? And those fries? I've literally dreamed about those fries. Too much for him to take care of. He couldn't possibly do it all himself. For a moment, Adele forgot they were talking about her uncle and looked again at Nate. His fingers were moving fast and smooth on the strings, but his body stayed still, those long legs of his, slightly bent, ready to catch the guitar if it fell. Or a woman. So, you and your sisters? Adele almost stumbled. Yeah, we'd never be able to fix this place up. Even as she said the words, she felt herself fighting against them in her mind. Fixing? What couldn't she fix when it came right down to it? Her whole job had been fixing. People wrote songs and they paid her to fix them, to make them better. It was good, dependable money. And she was great at it. She fixed her friends' love lives, cushioning the blows of bad breakups and setting them up with people who were better for them. She fixed the things that broke in her old apartment, the toaster, the washing machine, perennially pissing off her ex-boyfriend, who thought that if he couldn't fix a pipe, and he couldn't, that they should hire a plumber instead of letting her work on it. Not many people would be able to set a ship like this to rights. It's already basically sunk, said Hank. The song slowed to a close, and Hank gave her one last spin before drawing her back. Good crowd tonight, though. His band really gets them in. It took a moment for Adele to realize he was serious. He thought the dozen people in the bar listening was a good turnout. He gave her a short bow and winked. Don't underestimate Nate. He's the real deal. Adele gave a silly, awkward curtsy. They clapped for the band. Nate ducked his head and stepped backward, giving the spotlight to Scrugg. And even though she tried, she really tried, Adele couldn't help the fact that her eyes still strained to see him through the darkness. Chapter 10. Adele didn't think she'd ever kicked so much in her life. She woke in Nate's borrowed bed, no, the hotel's bed, with her legs aching as if she'd been running all night. The mattress was too thin, or too old, or maybe it was too firm. Her broken sleep surely didn't have anything to do with its normal occupant, and the way she'd kept waking up with Nate's image walking through her dreams. No. She thought with longing of her old bed in Nashville. It had been just right, a queen, soft on top but firm underneath. She'd sold it, along with almost everything else she owned, which after the huge garage sale she'd had before leaving Nashville wasn't all that much. She still had 4 boxes of Darling Songbird memorabilia, and her mother's hutch, the one she'd carted along with her no matter where she'd moved. All the rest of Adele's possessions had fit in a tiny storage unit, with room to spare. If only she'd gotten the messages about Uncle Hugh in time. She knew it didn't sound plausible, and if she'd been to a funeral to which no family member showed up, she wouldn't believe a single excuse. There wasn't a good enough justification in the world. But that was the truth. She hadn't been home to get the first crushing message from the coroner. Apparently, he and Uncle Hugh had been fishing buddies, and the coroner's voice had cracked as he spoke to her voicemail. She still hadn't been home when the second message landed from a man with a low voice who said, I need to know if your uncle wanted a memorial, and if he did, what kind, because I have no clue what would be best. He'd left a number, but not a name. She'd been absolutely unreachable, and God, how she wished she hadn't been. For the previous 6 months, she'd been dating a race car driver, Mitch, who was blonde and funny and good in bed. They were equally semi-famous. Neither of them minded when they went out to dinner, and people tilted their heads but couldn't quite figure out who they were. It wasn't until they hit the second mile of a 14-day backpacking trip in Cumberland Gap that she'd also realized he was a very bad planner. And he wasn't much of an actual hiker either. Adele had been training since Mitch had invited her to come along. She'd been hiking with cans of soup in her backpack on Mitch's race days, and she'd been studying how to find water. She'd bought the smallest, most portable water purifier on the market. She'd read Wild and had seen the movie, too. Less than an hour into the hike, right after they'd left cell range, Mitch had had a panic attack and decided he couldn't figure out what to do next. She'd had to take over the route planning and redo his poor plans from paper maps. At 5 days in, they'd crossed a major road, and Mitch, plagued by blisters as big as strawberries because he hadn't done a day's worth of training, hitched a ride back to the city. Adele had waved him off with an acute rush of relief, and then she'd continued to walk the rest of the planned 11 days. It had been grueling, and during one particularly extended lightning storm, terrifying. But she'd been happy when she came home alone. She'd opened her apartment door, glad no one was with her. She could have the first shower, the first lie down on the living room floor. She'd opened her mail, and she'd found the eviction notice. Her apartment in Nashville, the place she'd lived for the last 10 years, was half an old Victorian, and the owner had sold the building in order to make it into a doctor's office. Then she'd listened to her voice messages. and found that at some point, while she'd been sleeping by herself under the stars, while she'd been writing songs on the trail and singing them to herself over and over so she'd remember them until she pulled out her notebook, her uncle had been dying, and then he'd been buried. No one had Molly's or Lana's contact info, just hers, so none of them, not one, had been there to represent the Darling family. And there was nothing she could do about it. She couldn't fix it. Nothing could make that kind of wrong right. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't malicious. Adele and Molly had been talking about going to Darling Bay for the last couple of years. Lana had sent Molly a postcard that said she might visit Uncle Hugh on her way to Baja, but it turned out she'd gone to Alaska instead. Adele would lay money on both her sisters being scared of going to Darling Bay, scared of being in town for the first time without their father there with them. Unbearable, really, how much sadness she'd always felt when she thought of Darling Bay. None of it had gone the way it should have, and there was nothing Adele could do about it now. So she'd held the garage sale and put the rest of her things into storage. She'd handed in her keys and gotten back her deposit. She bought a plane ticket and rented a car, and now here she was. And surprisingly, being there wasn't as heartbreaking as she'd imagined it would be. Every corner, every nook of the space held a memory or two. But it felt good to be here, where the air smelled right, even if she was homeless. Funny, she hadn't thought about that word before. She owned no bed at all, especially not her perfect lost forever now bed. She hoped it was giving the woman who'd bought it, a new-to-town songwriter who'd had the same excited look on her face that Adele had once had, the best dreams possible. Adele twisted in the bed again, trying to unwind the crick in her neck. If this had been an actual hotel room currently being rented, she would have been tempted to write a review of it, telling future customers to avoid room 1 if possible. Reviews? Adele hadn't even thought to check them until that moment, which didn't make any sense. She was addicted to reviews. Something about them soothed her. When she couldn't sleep at home in Nashville, she sometimes brought up luggage sites on her phone and read the reviews of suitcases. It wasn't that she needed a new suitcase. She had a favorite that she owned and loved. It was more that she loved finding out what other people were lying in bed thinking about when they couldn't sleep, because who else would leave luggage reviews? For every bag, someone wrote that the quality of the zipper could be improved. Someone else always thought the pockets were too small, and for every review that said that, there were 3 other people who thought the pockets were too big. The wheels spun too freely, or they were too tight on their axles. Everyone had a way to make things better. It was a truism wherever she went. People had opinions, and they wanted to be heard. She pulled her cell off the nightstand and opened Yelp. The Golden Spike, Darling Bay. The Wi-Fi connection dropped and rebooted itself twice, and both times Adele logged back in quickly, skimming the reviews as quickly as she could before she lost connection again. Holy crap. It barely had 2 of 5 stars. That was bad. If she'd been a tourist driving up the coast, she would have seen that and would have kept skimming, not even bothering to read why it had earned such low reviews. Her finger would have kept flicking the screen until something with more stars made a click seem worthwhile. A tightness low in her gut, she opened the page. Dirty, old, grimy, grubby. Cafe closed. Hotel closed. Saloon, not worth the time it takes to get a watered-down vodka tonic. Keep driving. I was scared I might get stabbed in this place. Full of locals who looked like they might be missing important teeth. That wasn't true. Adele bristled and rolled onto her other side, wanting to give Relly 1 a piece of her mind. The locals were cowboys, ranchers, and fishermen. They might be working class, but that just made them better, stronger. It was a vibrant, tightly knit community. They weren't inbred, for God's sakes. If I could give this 0 stars, I would. Beer was warm. They said they had a problem with something and they were waiting on a part, but that's not a good answer. My boyfriend said his shot of whiskey was good, but I didn't like the way it tasted. So yuck. Since I can't leave less than 1 star, and because my boyfriend isn't on Yelp, I'll say that the bartender was hot. Like dirty hot, all growly and flannel-shirted and hot, but only because his package is probably so big it's getting squished by those tight Wranglers, you know? Maybe worth 1 star? No, definitely. I'd go back just for him, but not for the warm beer. Did Nate read online reviews? Somehow she doubted it, and a mischievous part of her wanted to show him that review, just to watch his face go darker. But then they'd both be thinking about his package, his big package. The sheets were making her too hot, and she pushed them off. She needed a shower. Then she'd find out if the bagel place was still making them fresh every morning. Then she had no idea what would follow next. Technically, she would need to contact the bank, she supposed, and Uncle Hugh's lawyer, figure out how to sell the property. Lord, what if it was worth so little that it didn't make sense to sell? A strange feeling shot through her, electric and sharp. It took her a moment to figure out what it was. It was hope. Just a little chip of it, but still brilliant and strange.